topic of today, which is the American cultural identity. We're going to be looking at really kind of two parts of the of our unit on the curriculum framework, both with Unit 3, the topic Developing an American Identity, and Unit 4, how a new national culture emerged in the wake of the American Revolution, and really we're going to consider, that's a kind of lengthy thing up here under thematic focus, American regional culture, creative expression, et cetera, but how these varying cultures play a role in shaping our society. And so we're going to be looking at the culture that is going to emerge from the colonial period into a new national identity. And there'll be some things I think we remember or recognize. And then we're going to be looking at a culture that will emerge in the post-war of 1812 era, with emphasis on, again, national identity, a new identity, and ideas from Europe that have influenced our culture and our development. Our background picture for this PowerPoint is the famous Thomas Cole oxbow painting, one of the great painters in American history. But we're going to be starting with really colonial culture at the time of the Revolution. And one of the things about the American artistic scene in the 1750s, the mid-18th century, was it was very, we would say, derivative or even a straight imitation. So if you were going to be a painter like Trumbull or Copley or West or Peel, and again, AP exam, I'm going to ask you for a single painter, certainly not on an LEQ or an DBQ. But what they will want you to consider is that how did art change over time? How did it go, and what did it reflect? So here you can see sort of the Revolutionary era artists. Their influence is overwhelmingly European, and their work is predominantly portraiture. So you see a lot of portraits during this period, particularly portraits of American leaders. So you have Franklin and Washington and Revere. Some very famous paintings here. That Thomas Jefferson painting cover a lot of books. And so you have four artists particularly in this period. Gilbert Stuart's going to come a little bit later. But you got West, Trumbull, Copley, and Peel. And, they pretty much painted American heroes. Stuart, like I said, a little bit later during the federal period, during President Washington's period. And he's particularly famous for his portraits of President Washington, most famously the Lansdowne portrait and the Athenaeum, which is, of course, graces the dollar bill. So these are kind of our first visual artists, beyond guys like Theodore de Bry, who did woodcuts back in the 17th century of Native Americans and things like that. But actual Americans creating art, original art, but kind of imitating the Europeans, particularly the post-Renaissance painters. Now, architecture was also sort of derivative, meaning that when you look at a Georgian building, it is similar to the construction and architecture style of England in the 18th century. This is a good example of the German immigrant house. So in many ways, it's like this house was picked up from the Holy Roman Empire, or the German states, and dropped right in the middle of Pennsylvania, or western Pennsylvania. And here you have the very first buildings built in New England, which were very similar to meeting houses in the towns that they came from in England. So kind of, art imitates life, and this art imitated the life that they had left. They had left Europe, but brought with it they and their parents' culture. It did emerge into some of the most beautiful houses in our part of the country, beyond the Victorian villa here in Danville and Chatham, in Millionaires Road. This is the original sort of rich homes of the planter elites. Again, another Georgian building. William Byrd, the very successful explorer and entrepreneur and plantation owner, his beautiful plantation Westover. Art is something we've talked about, but really, if you go back to colonial America, most writing was sermons and journals and diaries. But you have a sort of fantastic figure who emerges in writing, but with, I think, one of the first distinctive forms of American literature, and that's the American poet or poetess in the case of Phyllis Wheatley. She was a slave in New England, and she wrote some of the most fascinating poems about her experience from being a slave. Here she uses language like "my pagan land, Africa," but how to be a Christian. And so this was very popular. It certainly helped to feed an idea that slavery, and again, she's not a field hand, but slavery had somehow helped her by Christianizing her. But I think the larger point is that she was an effective, talented poet, and a truly kind of American poetry. So Phyllis Whately is often seen as America's first poet, and she was highly respected. Her work was even in George Washington's collection. But let's fast forward now from the colonial period, where most of the writing in the Revolutionary period, the guys like Thomas Paine and stuff like that. But now we've won the War of 1812. America has emerged finally to define that it has a distinctive identity, and initially the identity that we fully embrace is this sort of rugged wilderness individualism and the frontier lifestyle. And so you have the first group of American writers, recognized American writers, that are in New York City. These three fellows are writing about the same time in the 1820s, and they're called the Knickerbocker Group. You may remember the New York Knickerbockers, New York Knicks, the Dutch settlers. Some of them deal with those Dutch settlers, like Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Others deal with life on the frontier. Fenimore Cooper's Leather Stocking Tales, particularly The Last of the Mohicans. And William Cullen Bryant is our first sort of famous American white poet of his generation, and he writes essays and poems that are sort of broad thematically American values. And sort of these three authors, and then these subsequent two authors, capture at the core what makes up America in terms of literature and in characters. And it is an idea of individualism and self-reliance. So most famously, perhaps from this period, is Emerson's essay on self-reliance. It certainly is a virtue that we as Americans have prided ourselves on. And he will be the sort of granddaddy, or here it says the father of the next major literary period, which is called Transcendentalism. So Emerson is sort of the bridge from the Knickerbocker Group period into the next period of the Transcendentalists. And of course, you have neat kind of individuals in the case of Melville, Whale of a Tale here with Moby Dick, Man Against Nature, the rugged individual, Captain Ahab and Ishmael. And then you have other sort of interesting authors, I think, at the time, guys like Edgar Allan Poe, who don't quite fit in any sort of category that's normal in terms of a broad group. He's kind of an individual, a loner in many ways. But let's talk about a really fascinating literary movement that was also reflected in art, but it was one that was sort of shared concurrently across the pond. In Europe, you're going to have this movement called Romanticism. And it is going to be, Walter Scott, and a lot of Shelley and Keats and these great poets, and they're going to focus a lot of ways on the same things that Americans are focusing on in this school called Transcendentalism. Keep in mind, when I say school, and when you write school, you're not talking about a place, you're not talking about a building like Tunstall High School, but a shared sort of artistic point of view or artistic philosophy. So if you want to remind yourself of a time frame, this again is post-War of 1812, pre-Civil War, right there in the 1840s. And it's going to be embodied in several key components. And so one of the major things about both Romanticism and Transcendentalism is it's kind of a backlash to the sort of cold, harsh realism of the movement that was the Enlightenment. In many ways, the Enlightenment, the emphasis on reason, the emphasis on logic took us away from the senses they felt. It took us away from a sort of metaphysical experience, a spiritual experience, if you will. And I jokingly say in class, these are like the original hippies, or kind of a counterculture movement of art. But in some ways, they were reacting to this sort of insistence on relying solely on your intellect or reason. Much more of an emotional artistic period, both anger and fear, horror, beauty, passion, all of these things were elements of the Transcendentalists, but particularly the relationship with nature, and the individual in nature. And so you were trying to have a sort of spiritual or metaphysical experience outside of your intellect, and much more of an emotional experience. So what they kind of are trying to do is get an out-of-body experience, get out of your body to discover what are truths in nature, truths in your senses, and stop focusing solely on, can you put it in a beaker or measure it on a scale. And so they were spiritual. They were not the sort of cold, aloof kind of religious beliefs uh, of deism, but they were not particularly orthodox in any kind of religious views. In other words, most of these people did not go to church, did not attend church. They found God in nature. And so for them, nature and nature's God was really something, and that God was in all of us, not sort of a guy sitting off in the heavens. And that we all shared sort of a common soul, very similar to Eastern religious philosophies like Buddhism and Hinduism. And so they weren't, like I said, really churchgoers. In fact, they really rejected things like orthodox religious beliefs altogether. But their philosophical attitude expressed itself artistically very well. And so with this, they fought against this idea of the divine spark. They would fight against things that they considered to be immoral, not because of a religious code or ethic, but immoral in terms of nature. And particularly that, if slavery existed, for example, this was anathema against the nature of humanity. It was corrupting our soul. And so for the role of the transcendentalist was to elevate humanity to its sort of greatest potential. And so while men like Jefferson sought to do this through academics, these folks sought to do this through artistry, and in a sense that we could reach the divine spark. Some people look at creativity as the sort of godlike aspect of humanity, the ability to create. And so you have these writers and these intellectuals, mostly in Massachusetts. This is where you're going to find the bulk of these writers and works that are published, starting with Emerson. Emerson is most famous for a collection that he does called Nature, and then his essay on self-reliance. And so definitely know these. He also was an intellectual. He was a scholar. And in many ways, Emerson is not the great artist of transcendentalism as much as he is the intellectual. It will really be his two successors in Thoreau and Whitman that are the kind of the great, true great American poets. But he is a participant and a lecturer. You may recall the Lyceum lectures. He's one of those. And a friend of his, Thoreau, was the individual who probably took it the furthest at that time, pre-Civil War. Thoreau, of course, was reacting to things like the Mexican-American War with his famous essay on civil disobedience, his belief that man should get back to nature. If there's anything to be said positively about the current pandemic, it's that a lot of folks are rediscovering or discovering for the first time the beauty of nature and the opportunity to be alone in it. And that's certainly something that Thoreau embraced in his classic work, Walden Pond. But the other thing Thoreau is very influential in is the development of a political ideology that will have enormous influences in the future on men like Gandhi and Martin Luther King. And it is the idea of civil disobedience. And so civil disobedience is the idea that you cannot respect a law if it is not right, i.e. moral. The only obligation I have is to assume to do what I think is moral or right. Therefore, I'm not going to pay taxes to the idea of slavery spreading and seizing land from Mexico. So for Thoreau, he is going to not pay his taxes and go to jail as a conscientious objector, as an opponent, a civil disobedient of a law mandating that he does something that he considers immoral. And this is a long tradition in the American political culture of protest, and he chooses to protest in a way that is nonviolent by simply not cooperating and obeying the law. And so civil disobedience will pass into the nature of democratic societies as a democratic way to resist laws without sort of engaging in violence, or as he says, would not be a violent and bloody measure, a peaceable revolution. So one thing I do like to point out that's usually overlooked, or this person's often overlooked, is the influence of Margaret Fuller, who was the editor and publisher of a magazine in which a lot of the works that I just talked about were originally published there in Boston, called The Dial. So if you ever see an excerpt from Margaret Fuller or the Dial, she's an individual who saw the role of women as equal to men, and so here you have sort of another early feminist. Woman the poem, man the poet, and woman the heart, man the head. So she does make distinctions, but argues that that's really ridiculous because it doesn't transcend. In other words, that's kind of society, she says when she's writing this. We should transcend this. You shouldn't be bound by these sort of cultural identities. So in other words, we need to have this combination of men and women in artistry. It can't solely be one without the other. And we must go beyond them. We must transcend. So she was clearly a transcendentalist as well, and I would put her in the list with the others. So what did they want to accomplish? So they want to end slavery. As I said earlier, both Emerson and Thoreau were very much opposed to slavery. Thoreau, as you just heard, will go to jail in opposition to the Mexican War. Emerson is going to be furious at, you may remember Daniel Webster. Webster is going to help create something called the Compromise of 1850, which allows for a more stringent fugitive slave law, and Emerson is furious about that. So anything that involved the spread of slavery or the kind of solidification of slavery, these writers were against. They cared for the poor. They believed that all humans were in essence equal, and thus that they should be equally treated. They advocated for schooling, particularly these are New Englanders, where that was kind of more common, and they tried to help those. So in many ways, we look at this as a sort of a moralistic crusade. They are post Second Great Awakening, but again, these aren't Baptists and Methodists doing this. These are folks that are seeing sort of a more holistic approach to spirituality, with less emphasis on organized religion. So nonetheless, like I said, these are kind of like the New England hippies of the antebellum period. But their goals were admirable, and certainly I think since their passing have become more important in American cultural history. At the time, I'm not sure how much this influence was beyond New England, but certainly today the average high school student reads at least some of their works. And like I said, Whitman is going to kind of emerge post-transcendentalist, although he is a product of them, and he will really peak during the post-Civil War period. Now, not everybody liked the transcendentalists. Some people thought they were crazy, and chose to criticize their sort of idealism. The thought of sort of a perfect humanity, really, in the case of Hawthorne, thought was preposterous. He was also making fun of a communal activity that the transcendentalists tried called the Brook Farm experiment, which he really made fun of that as well, in his novel, The Blithedale Romance. And so, for him, he's what we would kind of look at as a comparable figure in context to Charles Dickens, that life is really much more of an imperfect place. And it's good to illustrate the sort of negativity of the world in order to improve it, rather than to escape the world and transcend it. So for him, with works like The Scarlet Letter, in which he criticizes the puritanical perspective on adultery, and some of his other works, he's much more sort of grounded in the realism of the antebellum period too. So you have a different perspective than sheer transcendentalism reflected in his work. Now, one of the neat things about Romanticism or transcendentalism in America is that it also influenced, the same philosophy basically influenced painters. And the painters that emerged were not all in New York, but they become known as the Hudson River School. And the Hudson River School, most of their work was centered around central and western New York, but some of these were individuals who had traveled west and painted what they saw. And when you think about the function of art as a reflection, a mirror of life, this to me is even more nationalistic than reading an emerging nationalist literature. This is more nationalistic in a sense that it's sort of capturing the one thing about the United States that is in the minds of these artists so exceptional, and that is our extraordinarily natural gifts. So they, like the transcendentalists, absolutely loved nature. They thought it was just, it dwarfed us as the individual. It was so powerful, and America had so much wilderness, so much land to be explored and not necessarily developed. These guys were not industrialists. They didn't look at an empty field and say, oh, it needs a Dollar General in it. But they did look at it as art itself, as beauty itself. And out of this is what came inspiration. You might recall that Leonardo da Vinci once said that nature was the best teacher. It was the person's best teacher, and these folks certainly considered that true as well. They would go and commune, if you will, with nature, and paint these. It wouldn't be unusual to come across some man with a canvas set up on the end of a field, staring out over one of these beautiful vistas, like here in Virginia on Skyline Drive. So they were the visual element of transcendentalism. And art could show values, morality, spirituality. And this is how we could reach a more defined connection with the oversoul, the universal mind. And so here you see this, and you'll continue to. And I'm usually, you can almost immediately recognize a Hudson River School because it's an enormous landscape. These guys were not at all interested in painting portraits. They weren't interested really in painting people. And people today look at these things and they're like, oh, it's a landscape painting. Ooh. But they were playing with optics. They were trying to do things on how light and water appeared. And you'll frequently see, as you do here in the foreground of the Oxbow, a broken tree stump. The idea of somehow we've influenced nature, we've impacted nature, just a scotch. So this is kind of like the broken tree stump. So again, themes are, if you're looking for context, this is the 1820s to the 1850s primarily. So post-war of 1812, pre-sectional really emergence, and lots of large-scale thought. It is during the period of the Oregon Trail. It is during the period of the Mexican War. So this idea of manifest destiny creeps in, not necessarily in what they share the value of, but in their experience of America. Like we have expanded westward. And this is something that for us today as Americans is not the same puzzle that they were dealing with in the 1820s. They were trying to develop, and it's, what's fascinating to me is the same thing is occurring in Europe, particularly in the German states. So if you recall, in Europe, Germany was really a collection of individual kingdoms that dated back to the Middle Ages, called the Holy Roman Empire. And post-Napoleon, it was this German confederation. And so what did it mean to be German? Because it wasn't a country. Well, the same question, what does it mean to be American? We have all these disparate people, all this vast land. And so in Europe, to give you, again, a context, you have guys like the Brothers Grimm, real people who went around and collected all the various fairy tales, if you want to call them that, or local lore, legend, and anthologized it and turned it into a German history. Unfortunately, Hitler would really capitalize on this. He would kind of create this myth of Germany's past. Well, here in America, we have an idealized version of this past as well. We look back on this as a period of American exceptionalism, a period of American expansion, and it's partially as a result of this desire to create an American narrative. Like, what does it mean to be an American? Obviously, this was a reality. You're going to see Native Americans depicted in ways that are not flattering at times, not always, but they were not radical extremists. These were people who were alarmed by the fire eaters in the South and the really radicalized abolitionists. They were trying to find a sort of an organic lifestyle in existence in their painting. And of course, they're critical of the Industrial Revolution, which is true of the Romantics as well. To think about a romantic in England, you have Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein, which is sort of a statement of this is where science has gone wrong. And so, the price of progress is we pay paradise and put up a parking lot kind of thing. So this is the concern that they have. And here you see one of the earliest works. Notice again how small here in Nature's Wonderland humans are. You can see here in the foreground, it's a tiny little person. These magnificent canyons and bold relationship of the earth to the spectator. And this is Thomas Cole. He's the Catskill Mountain Range. You can see here off in the distance, people in the foreground sort of having a picnic or something, but fairly pastoral, very, I think lovely. If you spend time like I do on the Dan River, it's best when it's, I think, least interfered with by people, by commerce, by industry. And so Thomas Cole will be by far the most recognizable of these painters. This is the painting that is actually the background for our slideshow. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. It's magnificent. And these paintings, this presentation doesn't really give justice to it, are mammoth. They're very, very big. So try to, again, imagine humans, not so important. And you know, here's what we call an oxbow. It's a type of river formed here. And then this is by far his most famous collection. He had visited Rome in Europe, you know, Rome and Italy. And he had thought about that in relationship to the United States and about the sort of path, as he titled, the course of empires. It's a 5-part series. If you were drop one of these in, you would say, okay, well, where does America fit in 1820s, 1840s in this period? And so he goes from start, you know, pre-American, pre-European, to where the natives lived here, all the way to its end of the empire, so to speak. So we'll look at each one here for a second. Here's Cole's savage state. Savage meaning, you know, not really civilized. Native Americans kind of almost, actually, it's, I think, like almost cavemen, like hunter-gatherers, but you can see some small teepees off in the distance. Very, very overcome with nature almost. People just really are insignificant in the painting. And then you have what we might consider the Jeffersonian idealized state. This is the pastoral or Arcadia, and so here you see almost like druidic circles up here in the distance, and lovely little vignettes here, people kind of enjoying nature and not really a footprint much at all. And you know, for men during this period, I think this is what they would hope society to look like. You know, more like this than say like that. So you know, you can see this transformation. Here is the Roman Empire, the potential American Empire in 1836. And as Cole argues, all empires go from that to that. This is the fall, the destruction, and then this is when nature sort of retakes it over. So he's kind of done the entire course of empire here in a 5-piece painting, all of which, except for the first, were painted in 1836. As a point of reference, you may recall that the Panic of 1837 is the next year. So he's doing this during Andrew Jackson's presidency. He's painting during that time period. And that's kind of really the peak of the Hudson River School. Asher Duran, you can see here again, man and nature. I'm always fascinated by these guys who hike in the wilderness in full suits, you know, like a coat, waistcoat. And, you know, when I go, I've got all my Columbia gear on, ready for the wilderness. And these guys look like they just took a stroll out of some sort of Victorian building. So anyway, yeah, here's the nature, lovely stream, waterfall in the distance, and mountains. Great use of perspective. Here we have an introduction to what will become known as luminescence, gorgeous use of light. Frederick Church's Niagara, if you've ever been to Niagara Falls, this is without all the sort of hotels built around it, you know, but really gorgeous place. Western New York, keep that in mind. And for probably, for most Americans, the most recognized painter. Now, he is not a Hudson River School painter, so I want to make a stop there and say, of all the people that had probably the most influence on the early Americans, and later, is John J. Audubon. He helped create the Audubon Society. He was an ornithologist. You know, he loved birds, and he sort of collected and created imagery of almost all the North American birds or that he could find, certainly, which are hundreds of huge paintings, prints, and they're all over the country. And almost any museum you go to is going to have at least a half dozen or so Audubon prints. And this is how we became familiar with the American birds, particularly. Very, very gorgeous paintings. Now, I mentioned the Luminous. I don't think you would have to actually know the name of the Luminous, but not all painters during the period are Hudson River. These guys, as you can see, are painting waterscapes, particularly the play of light and water, using oil. Here you see again water being a major theme in New England. This is the old Ironsides, USS Constitution. You notice the years, Mexican War period. And then here you've probably seen this one. I think it's in our text. Sort of fur trappers languidly rolling down the Missouri River. This tells you that Bingham, you know, probably has either been to Missouri, across the Mississippi, or certainly heard about it. I think he I don't know the background of this painting, but I know it's a pretty recognizable one, the old Coureur de Bois. And then another element of art during this period is a a not revival in America. It's first time in America, but in Europe, it was called the imperial style, the empire style under Napoleon. But we call this today neoclassical. So, you know, the Renaissance was back in the 1400s. Didn't really make its way to Europe architectural. I mean, excuse me, America. But in the post-war of 1812, after the American Capitol had been destroyed, you know, the White House had been burned, the Capitol had been destroyed. This has an opportunity to really shine. It is neoclassical, new old, of the Greek and Romans. And so here you see a tax collecting building, which looks very similar to the Pantheon minus the dome. In fact, it's almost an exact replica. Here you see perhaps the most famous of all the neoclassicals creators, and that's Thomas Jefferson. This is the Rotunda at UVA. He also, of course, famously built Monticello, which was a Renaissance villa, and that beauty. Here you see the dome in the U.S. Capitol from the interior, with frescoes up in the very top. This is where George Washington is in the ceiling, sort of divinely looking down on us. And so a lot of this throughout American architecture, I definitely didn't give you much in this PowerPoint, but you know, take a trip to DC, you're going to see lots of neoclassical architecture or classical. And then art also reflected an idealized version of the American past. And by that I mean it's meant to inspire patriotism. It's meant to be, in a way, a romanticized view of history. So here you see, you know, the Pilgrim's Landing. You see Bradford swearing his oath. You see, you know, almost a Renaissance virginal female figure in the foreground. Notice the piety of the people participating, the religious nature of it. They're praying. And then perhaps the most famous of all the patriotic paintings, you know, one that I absolutely love. Emanuel Lurtz, a German immigrant, a 48er, had come over here during this huge period of immigration, and he was kind of concerned about, you know, the rise of sectionalism, 1850s, and he was concerned about, you know, that we were getting away from this idea of a unified nation state, and he wanted to create an image. And this, again, is mammoth. I've shown this to you guys in classwork and students. You get stood on top of it, in front of it, and it is huge. Obviously, this is a romanticized or idealized version of this. You know, we're not glaciers floating down the Delaware River isn't accurate. Each person in the vote represents a different sort of class, ethnic, and geographic region. Washington, of course, did not stand astride the you know, this very narrow-looking canoe. These were flat barges. You know, Henry Knox was with him. I think I've told you guys the story that Knox was embarrassed because he and Washington were the last to board the boat. And Washington, you know, kind of chides him and says, "Sit your fat ass down, Harry, or you'll tip the boat." But that's not what's depicted here. Not a very realistic portrayal, and that's not really what Lurtz is going for. He's trying to inspire the American public to become more patriotic to the Union. Here again, you see Washington, as I've shown you before, depicted as sort of, you know, the bare-chested Caesar, or even more, the bare-chested Apollo, or gosh, Zeus himself. So, you know, as a Roman god, the Greco-Roman and patriotic style. And obviously Washington never sat like this in sandals with a bare chest. So you're basically seeing him converted into a Greek figure, almost deistic figure. You may recall that he was perceived by his peers as Cincinnatus, the great Roman hero, the deliverer of the Roman Republic. And so very idealized. And I think this is really kind of neat painting right here at the Civil War. The Civil War is breaking out, and you know, Johnny Cash sings a song, "The Ragged Old Flag," and this kind of reminds me of that whenever I see it. Sort of the flag in tatters, but it's in the heavens, and you can see it on the skyline. So beautiful painting. And then you had some artists go out and want to capture. I don't know if they were visionary enough to say, "Oh, I need to get these guys painted before they're all gone," but certainly they wanted to capture them in the Native Americans in their customs and in their true environment. And so here you see several of the Pawnee chiefs, you know, particularly War Eagle, depicted by Charles King, 1821, just 6 years after the end of the war, 1812. And this becomes the sort of noble nature of the Native American, the quote noble savage. You'll notice that these individuals have sort of intensity and a stoicism and pride, and not necessarily a savage. The savage part would be maybe the way they're dressed or their hair. You know, kind of look like a lot of teenagers today, maybe. But no, these are the noble savages, so-called. And here you have George Catlin, who we've already talked about, who really gives us a lot of what we know about Native Americans visually. He lived amongst them for a period. He was our kind of our first naturalist, environmentalist, very famous. And he, like I said before, takes that idea of the Indian as the stoic, contemplative Indian, which is very common. You sort of have a couple different perspectives. This is one perspective that kind of perpetuates, and this is the demon, savage Indian, you know, this come to murder you. This one is the more, you know, dealing with his fate, with stoicism. There's more the scout dance, and all of these were in some ways realistic. These things did happen, although, you know, by perpetuating this image, it creates a sort of mono narrative, a mono myth of the natives as savages who do nothing but kill women and children, and that's unfortunate. I'm not saying it never happened, but you know, this is what is getting painted, this is what people see, and this is what they think or write about. Here you can see a fascinating painting, particularly if you think about the paintings of the frontier we're going to look at too, by guys like Lurch and others. And that is this sort of Native American looking off into the distance and really contemplating the reality of the end of his society and culture, the quote doomed Indian. One of my favorite pictures that I got here is this sculpture of the very Renaissance era, I think neoclassical again, but it reminds me very much of a French sculptor named Auguste Rodin, who sculpted a sculpture called The Thinker. And so here is the native chief contemplating the thinking about his future, and he doesn't look very happy about it, despondent even. So it's pretty cool sculpture. So that summarizes what we have, and hopefully that will take you up to the Civil War. And then we'll consider afterwards, you know, what happened in terms of art in the 20th century.